Welcome back, beloveds. Today, I want to kind of explore this dichotomy between neutrality and objectivity versus conviction and taking a position in congruence with one's own inner truth and sense of right or sense of justice. And this is something that honestly plagues me. I experience a lot of inner conflict between this dichotomy, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. But I also see this challenge playing out in many spaces that I'm connected to. And so it feels like something that I personally want to explore for myself. And not that I haven't already been doing these explorations internally, but it felt like something that I wanted to bring into this space. And I feel that there are probably a number of other people who can resonate or relate to the ways in which this can create a sense of inner conflict. And so I'm not really coming to today's episode or conversation with any kind of answer or proposal. But really, I just want to look at the different layers of nuance and complexity that I feel are present within this dichotomy. And I think it can be helpful to kind of paint the picture of my own personal journey and the different parts and processes that have shaped what has led to this now internal conflict, because it wasn't always that way for me. And maybe you can see parts of your own experience reflected in my story. And then I just want to explore how I see this showing up in the collective as well, or the ways that it could or might. Because again, for me, there is no kind of concrete here. There's no either or, black or white, right or wrong. I think there is so much gray, which is literally what creates the conflict that I experience around this. And, when I was younger, I was very opinionated and I had very clear points of view on things. I had so much conviction as a young person, even as a child, and I was reprimanded for it constantly. I was constantly told that I was too opinionated, too headstrong. I think that there were times in which me expressing my conviction could come across as judgment. And maybe it was, right? Like, I think I was much more judgmental when I was younger. And specifically in the context of growing up with my grandfather, who I've shared this before, but who really had this deep-seated hatred toward Turkish people, which there was a history that shaped his hatred, right? Having lost his family, his father's family specifically, having been murdered. I think that he held on to this kind of hatred for reasons that were deeply personal. But the ways in which that became a generalization toward Turkish people or toward people who are Muslim, the way in which that was expressed and how it never sat well with me. This was something that I, as a young person, felt very comfortable and confident calling out as problematic, which my calling out of this was seen as problematic by my family. My mother found me to be very disrespectful. And of course, I come from Greek culture. It's collectivist. You respect your elders. You don't speak to elders in that way. I remember once I literally told my grandfather, which I don't think I realized in Greek, kind of the gravity of the connotation of the way in which I said this, but I basically said to him that he should be ashamed of himself. And I think I was like 11 or 12 when I said this. And so, of course, it was like the ways in which I expressed the clarity and conviction I felt around certain things was seen as disrespectful and was seen as arrogance. And I think because I was admonished so often for that aspect of my personality, it became something that I started to feel shame around. And then I went to graduate school where I studied cultural anthropology. And we're very much trained to take a neutral or objective perspective within that field. Firstly, the way in which we do research, ethnographic research, The role that we play in that process of going into a community that is not our own to research the ways in which certain things are playing out within that cultural context. We take on the role of what is called a participant observer, which means that you are participating in the culture, you're building relationships with people, you are there as an active participant, but you are an observer. You are someone who is participating for the purpose of observing what is happening. And the idea with that is that you are meant to remain neutral in that observation. You are not meant to have a position around what is right or wrong because it is not your community, it is not your culture. You are meant to be there simply to observe and to be objective in that observation. And there was this whole movement within the field of anthropology in the 70s or 80s, I can't remember exactly, the reflexive turn, where it became incredibly important that anthropologists were engaging in reflexivity, meaning that they were reflecting on their role within a situation and the ways in which their presence impacts a dynamic. So, can we actually be neutral or objective observers? Because our very presence implies a power dynamic. We are coming to a situation from a particular lens, which is shaped by our own cultural context. Therefore, there is no way in which we can observe what is happening without an element of bias. And so, what happened was that it became very important within ethnographic research for an anthropologist to be explicit about the bias that they brought to any interaction or dynamic or situation. So that an anthropologist needed to name what is the bias that is present? What is the worldview that I am observing from? And in what ways does that influence or impact my observations? Because they can't actually be neutral or objective because I am an inherently biased individual. I am coming with biases. There is no way that I actually can observe a situation in a way that is not biased. I think that this was a big part of the reason that advocacy and activism was looked down on. So if you were an anthropologist and you were actively advocating for some position, that was seen as problematic. I think things have shifted. Of course, I've been away from that world for, well, I don't know. I was in grad school like 15 years ago. So, of course, I don't actually know what the present situation is. At that time, it was only becoming just kind of slightly more accepted for people to have some sort of stance and for people to be involved in advocacy and activism. But very often those people were kind of looked down on by a lot of other anthropologists, by the field at large. So it was still kind of a tenuous sort of position to take. Though I do think that it was becoming more accepted. But especially prior to that, it was very much not so accepted because if you are taking a stance, taking a position either for or against something, then you are obviously doing so with your bias at the center. So that was very much frowned upon, which I mean is very difficult, right? Because you are in a situation where oftentimes what's actually coming through in this ethnographic research, there's so many different things that different anthropologists are studying, but often they're looking at dynamics that lead to conflict, that lead to oppression, that lead to injustice, that lead to marginalization. And of course, you're very immersed in this culture, in this community, these dynamics. And so it would make sense, on the one hand, that it would be very difficult to remain neutral or objective. And on the other hand, because you are a biased person of privilege, it is also considered problematic then that you have some kind of stance or position on what's happening. And so This actually, for me, was a big turnoff. It was one of the reasons which I decided, there were several reasons, but one of the reasons I decided I didn't want to continue on with a PhD and spend 8 to 10 more years immersed in that field, which is like how long it takes to get a PhD in anthropology. 8 to 10 years, followed by then being an academic, writing books on these subjects that the majority of people will never read. One of the things that really put me off to that was this expectation that you don't take, and not necessarily take a side, but that you don't have an opinion that you share, or that you don't have a point of view or a perspective on the issues that you advocate for, which often means that you don't advocate for the people that you're connected to, that you're in community with, that you're researching, which of course that's problematic, right? Like to research people in that context. Anthropology itself was born out of colonialism. The field, the discipline, inherently, intrinsically comes from some problematic power dynamics. So that was also like a big piece of why it was thought that objectivity and neutrality was preferable to advocacy or activism. And so I was, like I said, I was turned off by that, and it was a reason that I didn't actually want to continue. What's so interesting, though, is that I really was influenced and impacted and shaped by that approach. And coming out of graduate school, let's say, the Myers-Briggs assessment. So previously, when I was younger, let's say when I was in undergrad, when I would take the Myers-Briggs assessment, my outcome was that I was ENFJ. E is extroverted, N is intuitive, F is feeling, and J is judgment. And in the context of the Myers-Briggs, judgment means that you just have a very clear sense of right or wrong, that for you there is kind of black and white in the world. And so I would have that result, that I had the J. After graduate school, it changed and I became an INFP, so introverted, which, anyways, that's a whole other thing, kind of like the switch from the E to the I, the extroverted to the introverted. I think there is a whole story with that. But the J versus the P. So the P in INFP is perceptive or perception. I can't remember exactly, but it basically means that you're not seeing things in black or white, that you're more inclined to see the gray in a situation, the nuance, the complexity. So prior to grad school, where I think I was very much trained to take an objective or neutral stance, I was identifying the world more in terms of black or white. I also was religious beforehand, so I think that that played a role in that as well. But afterward, it was like I saw the world in the gray. I saw the nuance and complexity, and I was trained to look for the nuance and complexity. And I think what that has done for me in many ways is that it has created this, I don't want to say, it's not true to say that I'm unable to take sides, because I actually do, but I feel conflicted about it. And that is because I do see the way my own bias plays a role in my perspectives and in what feels right or wrong or true to me. I do see my bias in that. I also see literally the nuance and complexity of situations. I can see that there are so many layers and factors at play that what oftentimes seems like the obvious right or wrong is actually a lot less obvious than it seems, because there are so many factors that create the conditions for a situation to be as it is. There's historical factors, cultural factors, geographical factors, political factors, economic factors, and they're all playing together to kind of orchestrate this unique web of experience and expression. And it's different from every other situation. Every context is unique because of the ways in which all of these factors play together with one another, just in the way that each of us is unique and each of us have a unique lived experience, because no one has lived the same life you have in the same way that you have because of the same different dynamics and factors and circumstances as you have had. And there are common threads running through. There are common threads running through our lived experience, no matter how different our lived experiences have been. There are common threads running through cultural contexts, no matter how unique those contexts are. And this is where it's like some of the complexity of that comes in. One common thread is that there are oppressive systems that exist worldwide, and all people are impacted by them, regardless of the ways in which they are impacted, regardless of how it happens, it still happens. The same for us as individuals. We are all impacted and affected and influenced by the systems within which we live, but all in different ways because of our positionality, because of our racial identities, because of our gender identity, because of all of the different ways in which we show up in the world as our own unique self, and how those systems are designed to, I don't know, to interact with these various identities, right? Where some are more privileged than others. So I often find myself conflicted when it comes to certain issues or social challenges or problematic dynamics in the world because I can see things from so many different perspectives and points of view. And I can see this myriad of conditions and circumstances that have shaped a situation. And then it's almost like I get stuck. I get stuck in the middle of it all. And I still do have this inner sense of like what does feel true for me or what I feel conviction around. I see one group of people being oppressed, and I see another group of people oppressing those people. My heart, in terms of what feels just or unjust to me, my heart is with those who have been oppressed. But the part of me that can understand the complexities that have shaped the oppressor, that part of me, I do have empathy. And I know for some people that might feel problematic, but I do because I have empathy for humanity and I have empathy for a human experience. So I can have empathy for both sides. And what that sometimes does for me is create almost like a sense of paralysis because I can see that people who inflict pain do so from a place of pain. And people who are put in a position to experience pain that has been imposed upon them, inflicted upon them. Of course, there's an injustice there. But the people who are inflicting the pain have also experienced some type of injustice that has led them to behave in that way. This is where I feel kind of conflicted and torn because I am wanting to support and advocate for those who are oppressed. But I'm also wanting to hold space and empathy and understanding for those who oppress. And I think if we're looking at the ways in which repair and reconciliation happen, it is true that people need to be seen and witnessed and met where they are in order to not collapse into shame. And it is the shame and the suppression or repression of that shame that leads people to wield their pain in destructive ways. I literally feel conflicted as I'm saying this. I can inside of me feel like there is some sort of tug of war. Like there is this war within me that reflects kind of the war that's happening outside of me. And I also think that the wars that happen outside of us are reflections of the wars that happen within us. Like I said, I don't have an answer. I'm totally not coming to this with any kind of answer or resolution. I'm just like, what do we do? What do we do when it is true that people are oppressed. And you've heard me talk before about these binaries. I don't think it is as simple as victim villain, perpetrator versus the abused. I just don't think that things are that simple. And they are that simple. It's hard. It's really hard. Because here's the thing. I think if we all had the capacity to be neutral and objective, the world would be a much better place. I don't know that we all have that capacity based on the ways that our brains work, based on the ways that we have evolutionarily evolved to respond to fear, which the world is wrought with fear. I don't know if we're actually capable of remaining neutral. If it were possible for every person in the world to do that, we would have peace. But is it possible for every person in the world to do that? I don't know. I'm inclined to say probably not. I don't know that we work that way. I told a friend of mine who is a veteran about this topic that I want to speak on, about how the wars outside of us reflect the wars within us. I think we're not necessarily at war with each other, but with the parts of ourselves we've denied or disowned. And this friend of mine who is a veteran said, humans have always been at war with one another. I wonder if it isn't just human nature to fight. And kind of what came up for me in that is, well, I think it's more that it's human nature to self-protect. And that is the reason that we fight, self-protection. And so, is it possible for us to actually always take some kind of neutral stance when we have this preoccupation, whether it be conscious or unconscious, to protect ourselves? That's even the reason why we feel afraid, because whatever it is that we're afraid of threatens our ability to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves safe, even if that's an illusion, just a perception and not even a reality. The illusion of threat is enough to activate our desire to self-protect. And that self-protection is rooted in a desire for self-preservation. And collectively, this is why people fight. This is why there is war. It is coming from a desire to preserve and protect oneself and one's community. So is it even possible for us to be neutral? I don't think so. I've been thinking too about Desmond Tutu. He said that if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And then Elie Wiesel has also been quoted as saying, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And I think in the context of the world within which we live, that is true. Actually, to remain neutral is to side with whoever is in power, because it is those who have been oppressed that are at a disadvantage in terms of having the power to alter their circumstances. When we live within a world that has been built upon systems of injustice, how do we disentangle from that if it is not the people who are responsible for implementing and upholding those systems? As I'm saying all of this, I have a million other things going on in my mind of what if this, what if that, what if that. So I'm connected to a lot of people on LinkedIn who work in peace building, a lot of people. And I have seen very few people, I don't know, maybe 5%, like very few people explicitly say anything about what is happening between Israel and Palestine, where we know their careers, their professional and probably personal lives, because if you go into work like that, it's because there's some personal reason for that. So for them, conflict and peacekeeping is core and central to their life and the ways they show up in life and navigate life. And yet there is this situation that is having a very global impact. And they're not saying anything about it. And I think it's because of exactly what I was sharing around how I was trained in anthropology. I think if you're working in a space where your intention is to bring two sides together, to find common ground, to build bridges, to understand one another, you can't take a side. You can't take a side in that context because you can't effectively mediate division if you're on one side, because you immediately alienate the other side by choosing a side. And so I see these people who I'm sure in their own hearts have a perspective. In their own hearts, they do have some sense of what feels right or wrong to them, or just or unjust. But to be vocal about that in the same way that an anthropologist is not supposed to be outspoken or vocal about some position within a community they work within, I think it's the same in this context. If you are to propose that one side has experienced injustice and the other side hasn't, there's something problematic about that because it compromises your ability to do your job. It compromises your ability to fulfill the purpose by which you exist in this space. And I think that's part of like where my struggle comes from too, because I am a bridge builder. I am a person who wants to help different people find common ground. I am a person who wants to facilitate an understanding of shared humanity despite difference, despite division, despite systemic influence and impact. Israel and Palestine is like a very, I want to say, a unique situation. They're all very unique. But I think there are almost like extra layers of complexity. So for me, are Israel's actions against the people in Gaza right now, is that complex in terms of whether it's right or wrong? For me, no. There is not a complexity in the fact that I do not believe it is okay by any means. I totally do not support the actions of the Israeli government in any capacity. But do I think that the history on both sides is complex? I really do. Can I understand how the complexities of history and geography and religion and all of these different aspects, can I understand how the circumstances for what is happening have been created? I can understand why it's happening. I still feel clear in myself that I have a clear conviction that it's not okay that it's happening. And I can understand why it's happening. And I remember when I was in graduate school, I was in graduate school from 2009 to 2012. So this is a reminder that what is happening between Israel and Palestine did not start in 2023. In some capacity, this has been going on for centuries. I remember when this would be brought up in class, Israel and Palestine, there was a palpable discomfort. I remember that our professors would speak about the relationship between Israel and Palestine with a certain kind of hesitancy. It was so different to anything we talked about. We talked about so many things that were fraught with tension and with complexity. And no one ever had the kind of energy they did when they talked about Israel and Palestine. There was something totally different to the energy in the room. You could feel the discomfort. And I really think that's because of the complexity that is inherent to this situation. I was in this workshop the other day. The purpose of the workshop was for our body of work, and so much of my body of work is looking at how the divisions between us reflect the disconnect within us. And I was thinking, how do I present this work that I want to do to these people in peace building in a way that's going to resonate with them? And some things that were coming up for me is like, maybe what people in that space need are the very things they don't think they need, and things they would actually be very resistant to. I feel that it could potentially be more effective to address the ways in which the roots of conflict are really born out of this disconnection within us. Because when you understand the complexities of cultural context, I think that's where the stuckness comes up. That's where that kind of paralysis shows up, because the inner experience of a person is very much shaped by the external reality, by the systemic conditions. They're not operating in a silo. So what's happening within me is still connected to what's happening outside of me. But it's my human response to what's happening outside of me that shapes the way it happens within me. And if we look at that human piece as the center, maybe that is what we need to do to effectively address the roots of conflict without collapsing in the complexities of cultural context. And then the question becomes, is that possible? In the same way that there's this question, is it possible for us to remain neutral? Is it possible for all of us to choose neutrality? Is it possible for us to examine our inner processes without the complexities of the cultural context? Our brains have literally been shaped differently depending on our cultural context. We don't actually have the same neurological wiring. People from individualistic countries or cultures have literally different neurological wiring than people from collectivist cultures. And people who grow up between cultures have different neurological wiring from either of those as well. And this also impacts our ability to truly empathize with people who come from different backgrounds as us. So it's like I'm always wrestling with these questions. And is there an answer? I don't know. I don't know if there's any answer. And something that I said, I don't know, I said it in one episode and I can't even remember exactly how I said it, but it almost feels like to me, the part of me that wants to keep the peace has to die for peace to be possible. And I was thinking about that in the context of peace building. What if, as peace builders, we actually have to give up the parts of us that want to keep the peace? Because we walk a fine line between peacekeeping and mediation and people pleasing and fawning. And I wonder if, in some sense, peace building would be more effective if we were actually going about it in ways that took sides. If a group has been subjected to injustice and we're not siding with them, how can they ever feel a sense of being seen or witnessed in their experience and validated in their experience? And then we come back to what I shared at the beginning, is that those who oppress and inflict harm, they're also doing so from a context in which complexities are present, where they have also experienced pain. The first time a person harms another person is not the first time they've experienced harm. In other words, they would not be harming someone if they had not first been harmed. Again, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe the answer is that we just need more compassion. I mean, we need more empathy. We need more understanding. We need to build our capacity to be with complexity. We need to build our capacity to be with nuance. How can we hold both? That for me feels like the question that I am really constantly wrestling with, is how can we hold both? How can we hold complexity and nuance and be able to see things from a number of different perspectives and points of view? And how can we look at all the various factors and circumstances that lead to particular conditions? And how can we have empathy and compassion for all those different aspects? And how can we remain true to the convictions in our hearts at the same time, in a way that honors everyone, in a way that honors the humanity of every person or group involved. And I think that is probably where the biggest challenge lies, that if we are focused on our self-preservation and self-protection, how can we honor our humanity and the humanity of those we disagree with, or those who go against what feels right and true in our hearts? And I really think that for me is why so much of my work is focused on the ways in which we hold so much pain within us. Because I really think that all of this is the result of the pain we hold within us. And what if we could just create a world in which it was more safe and more acceptable to be honest about the pain that lives within each of us and where that pain comes from? I do think that one of the reasons that it can be so hard for so many of us to hold complexity and nuance is because it is uncertain. And uncertainty for us feels like insecurity. Insecurity feels like lack of safety. Complexity, nuance, the gray, for a lot of people, that's very threatening. Actually, the reason binaries, black, white, either or, that way of thinking and relating to the world is actually a trauma response. Binaries are the result of trauma because there is something within us that feels as though there is more safety and security within certainty. This is why we create binaries. Well, if it's not black, it has to be white. If it's not good, it has to be bad. If it's not right, it has to be wrong. This is a way in which we create conditions to feel safe and secure, even if that safety and security is an illusion, even if it doesn't really exist. Binaries are a trauma response. And so it's because of our need to self-preserve and self-protect that the gray, the nuance, the complexity feels dangerous, feels threatening. And so we cling to the binaries. In clinging to the binaries, we are clinging to division. We are clinging to what separates us rather than what brings us together. So I guess again, my question is, how do we hold both? How do we hold nuance and complexity and our conviction? How do we hold the gray and honor the humanity of every person in the world? How do we do that? I don't have an answer, but I think that is the question before us, really. How do we build our capacity to hold both? And I think that a lot of that depends on how safe we feel. And how safe we feel depends on the conditions and circumstances we live within. And so, as long as there is injustice, as long as there are oppressive systems, I don't know that it's possible for us to feel safe enough to hold both. I don't know if that's possible. Maybe I've just thrown you into some kind of incapacitation. That's how I feel. Sometimes I feel like I'm incapacitated by the complexities of my own mind and the what ifs and the questions, all of the different layers that I find myself feeling really challenged by. Maybe the best I can do now is leave you with an invitation to practice holding both. What does that mean? What does that look like? I'm not quite sure. A big part of my life is engaging with this practice and trying to navigate what that means and what that looks like. And again, I don't have an answer for this is how you do it, but I wonder, how do you do it? What does it look like for you to practice that, to try to hold space for complexity and nuance, but also tune in to the clarity of your own conviction and the truth that lives within your heart? And can you feel deeply passionate about a point of view or perspective and hold it with reverence for what it reflects about your values and your sense of meaning and your sense of purpose? And can you hold that in your heart and choose to practice empathy and compassion for humanity, even when people don't agree with you, even when a person's point of view or perspective challenges or threatens your own. And I know that that is a lot easier said than done, especially for some people more so than others, for people who really are oppressed and unsafe. I don't think that those people need to have empathy and compassion necessarily for someone who wishes to cause them harm. But I wonder if we can practice having empathy and compassion for whatever it is might have led that person to want to cause harm. I wonder if what we're really holding empathy and compassion for is for the ways in which we have all been impacted by the systems we live within. I wonder if it's more about holding empathy and compassion for the complexity of human experience and all the ways that manifests and takes form. I don't know. Because the reality is that we do live in an unjust world. And the reality is that there are reasons for which that injustice exists. And I think what I feel called to is to honor the pain at the center of it all, the collectively shared ache of pain that many of us don't even have the capacity to see or to name or to be with. And maybe the task before us is to offer love to pain, is to meet pain with love. Maybe the best we can do when and where we feel we have the capacity to do so is to meet pain with love. Maybe that's my invitation to you. Can you practice meeting pain in all its shapes and forms with love?